Alright, in the last tutorial we talked about stacks and queues and some of the common operations that they have. So in this tutorial we're just going to play around with some code. Now the first thing that I want to point out is this using statement here. By including this using system.collections.generic, that gives us access to generic collections such as lists that we've been working with, and of course stacks and queues. So what I'm going to do is jump down here to main, and in this case I'm going to start by creating a list of ints. I'll call it myList, gets a new list of ints. And the thing that I wanted to point out is notice that we had to specify the data type here. In other words, it's not enough just to say that we want a list of ints, or we want a list of ogres, or whatever. Now the same thing is going to be true when we create a queue or a stack. So in this case I'll say queue of ints, and we'll call it myQueue, gets a new queue of ints, and there we go. We can do the same thing with a stack. I'll create a stack of ints, and in this case we'll call it myStack, and then we'll say gets a new stack of ints. Okay, at this point we can start to push some data onto the stack. So I'll say myStack.push, and for now let's just pass a 0. We could also say myStack.push and pass it an arbitrary number here, 45. And we'll do that once more, myStack.push, and we'll pass it a 17. And at this point we have a 0 on the bottom of the stack, a 45 right above that, and then a 17 on the top of the stack. So if I were to say int top of stack gets myStack.pop, what's going to happen is, just like we saw in the video tutorial, we're removing the top of the stack. In other words, we're taking the 17 off the top of the stack and we're putting it into our variable top of stack. So I can print this out. I can say console.writeLine top of stack, and if I were to run it now, you can see that we have a 17 on the screen. So let's do this. Let's push one more value. We'll push an 11, let's say, and then we'll want to print out the stack. So in this case I'm going to console.writeLine a whole bunch of bars here so we can visualize the stack, and then for each int I in my stack we'll just print it out, console.writeLine of I. And just like we did before, I'll grab this console.writeLine, copy it, paste it, and then if we were to run it now, let me move this over, you can see that we pushed a 0, a 45, and a 17, and then we popped the 17 and then pushed an 11. So if you look at the printout of the stack, it actually prints in the right order. On the top of the stack we have an 11, right below that we have a 45, and then at the bottom of the stack we have our 0. Now we can do the same thing for myQueue. So what I'll say is myQueue.enqueue, and we'll do similar kind of values here. I'll do a 0, myQueue.enqueue, we'll do a 45, and then myQueue.enqueue, and we'll do a 17. And just like the example above, we'll remove some data from this data structure. So I'll create a variable, int beginning of queue, and then I'll dequeue the first thing that's inside of the queue. So I'll say myQueue.dequeue. Now in this case, the beginning of the queue should be 0, so we can print that out, console.writeLine, beginning of queue. And if I were to run it now, you should see that the last thing that we have here is a 0 that prints out on the screen. Now let's go ahead and add our 11. I can say myQueue.enqueue, and we'll pass it the 11. And then just like we had here above, I can grab this console.writeLine, paste it here, and then for each int I in myQueue, we can come up here and console.writeLine I. Finally, what I'll do is I'll paste these bars down here at the bottom. And if I were to run it now, let me move it over here just a bit, you can see that our output is slightly different. In this case, we started with a 0 at the beginning of the queue, followed by a 45 and a 17. When we said myQueue.dequeue, it removed that 0 from the beginning of this queue, and then we enqueued an 11. So if you look here, you should see that we have a 45, a 17, and an 11 that's still in the queue, and then when we print it out, you can see the 45, 17, and 11. Now notice the different way that these things print out. Because this is a stack, we have an 11, 45, and 0, and down here we have our queue, which is 45, 17, and 11. So that's it for this tutorial. It was a little bit short, but hopefully it shows you a little bit of the practical side about working with stacks and queues.